In this series of lectures, we're learning about inchoate crimes. These are acts that are deemed criminal in themselves, but they're also considered incomplete or inchoate because they also lead up to other crimes. In this course in criminal law, we consider three inchoate crimes: attempt, solicitation, and conspiracy. In this particular part of the lecture, we're going to focus on the crime of conspiracy, which is an agreement between two or more guilty minds to commit a crime. As we have done with other crimes in this course, we're going to examine what prosecutor has to prove for the crime of conspiracy to be committed. That is, what does the actus reus entail, and what does the mens rea require? In addition, and this is a little different from other crimes, conspiracy serves as an important prosecutorial tool to hold all partners liable for future crimes, providing certain requirements are met. That's what makes the crime of conspiracy so appealing to prosecutors. By way of review, so far we've explored two other inchoate crimes: solicitation and attempt. As you will recall, solicitation is the asking, encouraging, enticing another to commit a crime. The actus reus for the crime of solicitation is an action that amounts to requesting another to commit a crime. There are two mens rea in solicitation. First, there must be the intent to ask, encourage, or entice another. We need to see that the actus reus is done purposefully. Second, the prosecution must prove that defendant had the specific intent to commit the target crime. Solicitation to commit. Asking is not enough. The asking must be accompanied by the intent to commit the target offense. As part of that discussion of what it means to require a specific intent, we looked at what happens when people joke their way through requests, or when they may be on the political stage engaging in hyperbole. Joking will negate the specific intent if the jury believes the defendant. Of course, that's only if the fact finder believes the defendant. Remember in our solicitation hypotheticals where John asks Al to kill John's ex-wife? It's all about the context. John sitting with hitman Al in a parked car talking in whispers feels very different from John sitting at a bar with his friend Al drinking and commiserating about their ex-wives. Same request, but was there the specific intent? The jury may buy the joking story in one and not so much in the other. We also learned that on the political stage, protecting the First Amendment creates a buffer, if you will, in what kind of words will be deemed criminal incitement. Courts protect abstract advocacy of violence under the First Amendment, so it won't be a solicitation, but they won't protect speech that incites others to imminent lawless acts. Finally, under solicitation, we considered what happens with failed communications. Does a failed communication still meet the actus reus of solicitation? So imagine this. Defendant leaves a voicemail on X's answering machine asking X to commit a certain crime. It's a pretty detailed message. It's lengthy, and there's no doubt in anyone's mind if they listen to that message that defendant means business. He intends for this crime to occur. But now suppose that X never listens to the voicemail message. That's what we call a failed communication. So how to analyze that? We learned that there's a split in view on whether a failed communication counts as the actus reus for solicitation. We can see the mens rea, but do we have an actus reus? Both views are backed by competing policies. On the one hand, some states like New Mexico and California follow the common law position that a failed communication is not a sufficient actus reus for solicitation. If the message was never received, then defendant never committed the crime of solicitation, no matter how much intent accompanied that failed communication. These states would say it's not sufficient. Okay, so that's one view. The other view is represented by the Model Penal Code, which rejects the common law position. The Model Penal Code says a failed communication will be sufficient for solicitation. The code specifically states that conduct designed to affect a communication will be sufficient whether or not X receives the communication. This theory rests on the assumption that defendant has demonstrated his dangerousness just by sending that voicemail message, even if it's never received. In our voicemail example, the Model Penal Code would say that by making the voicemail, defendant demonstrated conduct that was designed to affect the communication, and therefore defendant should be guilty of solicitation. We also discussed the crime of attempt much earlier in our course when we were looking at mens rea in the case of State versus Stewart. You recall it? That was where 3 men circled a victim in an enclosed bus stop. In practice, we wouldn't call it the crime of attempt. It's actually called the crime of attempted, fill in the blank, attempted robbery in the case of Stewart, or attempted murder, attempted larceny. The crime of attempt, no matter the target offense, requires the actus reus of sufficient acts tending to the commission of the crime, coupled with the mens rea of the specific intent to commit the target offense. Just like other crimes, an actus reus of sufficient acts tending to that crime, coupled with a mens rea of defendant's specific intent to commit that crime. That means that the specific intent to kill for attempted murder or the specific intent to commit a felony therein for attempted burglary, those have to be proven. We'd have to show that defendant intended to kill if defendant's going to be convicted of attempted murder. We'd have to show for attempted burglary that when defendant entered or broke and entered a home, he intended to commit a felony therein. Thinking about the actus reus, it's a fact-intensive discussion to determine what qualifies as sufficient acts tending to the commission of the crime. So in thinking about attempt crimes, we have to remember that all attempt crimes by definition haven't been completed. They have failed in some way, either because the defendant never got close enough to the victim perhaps, or was deterred by a police car driving by, or tried to light a fire and the wind blew it out, or he changed his mind. So it makes our analysis even more complicated to try to prove something that never was finalized. On proving the actus reus, we need to ask, how early do we want, as a matter of policy, to allow the police to intervene? The closer to the target offense, the more comfortable we are that the defendant was demonstrating his dangerousness. The further back in the plan we go, the further back in our movie, the less dangerous defendant may feel, or the more opportunity there is for defendant to change his mind. This indeed was the struggle faced in the movie Minority Report. Just how early in a timeline for an attempt crime can defendant be charged? Minority Report, of course, pushed it so far back the moment you even thought about a crime. But that's not what we think in modern law. In modern law, we're looking for sufficient acts tending to the commission of the crime. Let's take a basic example. If defendant breaks into a home to rape the sleeping homeowner inside, we know that defendant has committed a crime of burglary. Now my next question is, would that act of breaking in on the ground floor of a large home also qualify for the actus reus for attempted rape of someone who perhaps is sleeping on the second floor? Or would it require defendant to get much closer to the woman, perhaps have gone into the room and grabbed her? The words sufficient act tending to the commission of the crime don't give us much guidance to figure this out. But for our class, we're going to take the following view. It was expressed at common law and by a number of courts. Sufficient acts mean acts that are close in time and space to the completion of the crime. Think of the target offense. Let's move our movie back in time comfortably to a point where we're still close to completion to demonstrate the dangerousness. In State versus Stewart, where our 3 men surrounded the victim and demanded money, those were sufficient acts that tended to the commission of the robbery. We could see their dangerousness, we could see their plan. It would have been a completely different case if the 3 men were just walking towards the bus stop when they were stopped by police. Somebody inside the diner across the street had heard that they were going to go commit the robbery, but all you have is them walking across the street. Could we have charged them with attempted robbery when they walk across the street? Do you think that walking across the street, not yet encircling the victim, would be a sufficient act for purposes of sufficient acts tending to the commission of the robbery? Very doubtful. it wouldn't be close in time or space to the completed robbery. The victim's not in reach. The men are just walking towards the bus shelter without our really being able to demonstrate that they're close in time and space to the robbery. In fact, as you may recall, Stewart court assumed that the actus reus for attempted robbery was met, and the court only concentrated on whether defendants had the specific intent to rob at that time. And that's the next point with inchoate crimes. Both solicitation and attempt are specific intent crimes. To be guilty of these crimes, the acts must be accompanied by the actor's specific intent to carry out their target offenses. One last point on both solicitation and attempt. The doctrine of merger applies to each crime. Each will merge into the completed offense that follows. For solicitation, that means that solicitation is going to merge with the crime of conspiracy if there is an agreement between the two parties. For attempt, that means if the robbery actually did take place in State v. Stewart, any initial attempt would have been swallowed up by the robbery or would have merged into the completed offense of robbery. Defendants may be charged with both attempt and robbery or solicitation and conspiracy, but they can only be convicted of one of those.